Sarah, if you just want to let me know when, well, we'll know when we're recording. Okay, I see recording has started.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our event for Project Safe on stalking. It seems to be a subject that a lot of students have asked about, and I'm very grateful that we have three panelists here that will help answer our questions. I want to make sure that everybody is aware that we are recording, and we will be sharing this video internally. So if you don't, if you have any concern about that, you can, send me a message. So I would first like to welcome our panelists. And so we have here. We have Maddie Potter from Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. And Maddie has been working in victim services and adjacent fields in Allegheny County for the past 11 years. Her career began at Women's Center in November 2021, and she has the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence certifications, and is a Train the Trainer for the Maryland Model of Lethality Assessment Program, and is a certified forensic interviewer through the National Children's Advocacy Center. Her passion is working with underserved populations, and much of her work is dedicated to assisting immigrants, refugees, limited English-speaking individuals, women, children, and older adults. She's a University of Pittsburgh graduate with a BS in psychology and a language minor in French. Rebecca Graben is a Victims of Crime Act social worker for Neighborhood Legal Services. She works alongside a team of family law attorneys assisting clients seeking protection from the courts. This is most often the form of protective orders and child custody cases. In this role, Rebecca is able to provide support and facilitate connections for clients to vital community resources to promote strength and resiliency. Rebecca received her master's degree from the University of Southern California, focusing on trauma, interpersonal neurobiology, and traumatic brain injuries. While at USC, she worked with the USC Telehealth Program, the Trevor Project, and the Soledad Enrichment Action to provide services to high-risk individuals, families, and gang-affected communities. Her Bachelor of Arts was received from Point Park University in Behavioral Science and Forensics. And finally, we have Jane Lester, who is an advocacy manager at Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. Jane joined PAR in 2021, and her role is responsible for the delivery of services to victims and their families, including advocacy, assessment, crisis intervention, accompaniment in various settings, and short-term supportive counseling. Jane manages PAR juvenile court docket as well as direct services in PAR's adult, criminal, and Title IX dockets. Jane completed a law degree at University of Pittsburgh and has a background in immigration and asylum as well as human rights. So, really what I'm getting is that we have about 5 different panels that we can get the 3 of you to come back and work on, and that will be absolutely wonderful. My name is Dr. Erin Tunney, and I am the director of Project Safe. Project Safe is a Carlow University effort to prevent and respond to gender-based violence in the form of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking. We're going to ask questions of our panelists. If anybody has questions that they want to post in the chats, please do so, and we will be able to answer those. I would like this to be an opportunity for people to ask questions that they feel are important or relevant to their lives, so please don't hesitate to do so. So I'm going to start by asking each of you um, uh, to let me know how you define stalking and what forms of stalking do you most commonly see. Let's start with Maddie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you also for letting us be on this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things because they are very important for, us as a community to know. So my background is mainly in domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So for me, how I would define stalking is kind of focused in to intimate partner violence a little bit, but the definition of stalking from the criminal perspective, and it is a crime in the state of Pennsylvania as well as every other state in the United States. There is a stalking crime in every state, and there's also federal statutes, just so everyone's aware of that. So in Pennsylvania, it is a pattern of behaviors directed at a specific person by another person that would cause a reasonable concern of fear for a person's safety, well being, or the safety of others around them. Um, but oftentimes also like has some significant emotional distress to it as well. So the type of stalking I most often see is through intimate partner violence. It's usually during a relationship and sometimes after a relationship has ended that is, patterned by control or an inability for an abusive party to kind of let go of that relationship. So we see that a lot when a relationship is ending or maybe a new relationship is forming with the person who has left the relationship, if that makes sense. So, did I answer that question fully, Dr. Tunney? I can elaborate or pass it along to Rebecca or Jane.
Rebecca?
Thanks.
I think the only thing that I can add to what Maddie had already said is two different words. The first word is pervasive. The second word is co-occurring. And they are two of the most important words when looking at what we see reported back from victims that I commonly interact with. That the stalking for them is a behavior that is pervasive, that it is in every aspect of their lives, and it is always there to remind them that this other person is watching and wanting to gain access to their intimate moments, whatever those may be. And also that it's co-occurring. And I don't necessarily see a lot of people talk about the aspect of it being co-occurring. And I use that in the respect of something else is going on. This person is coming in for mental health treatment. This person is coming in for symptoms to their PCP. Um, they may reach out because of a domestic violence situation or a harassment situation that goes on. They reach out to the police. It's going on with something else. And usually you can find it and find the pathway to it and to get to those questions, to speak with a victim about it. Especially for me, one of the things that I look at is their safety. What does safety mean to them? How do we create a safety plan that works with their life and with their resources? Um, so how does that play together? And what do they feel that they can realistically do? So I will pass it off to Jane if she has anything else to add.
Yeah, well, I think you both covered the legal definition pretty well. I would say at par, since we do not have as many cases of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, we deal mostly with just sexual assault cases, that stalking does look a little different in those situations. Usually it is, the same type of pervasive, repetitive behavior, but usually it's related to threatening phone calls to drop charges, showing up at someone's house after receiving a PFA or having the police notify them of arrests. So there's like this retaliation aspect to it most often for our clients. This idea of like, if you do not stop the process that you've started, I'm going to keep showing up and calling you and harassing you. So there's definitely more of a after the fact kind of stalking and not prior to like the sexual assault incident stalking, although that does also occur.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'm wondering if each of you can give some examples of, like, just walk us through like an example of a stalking scenario that might be common for you, and so that we can kind of have some type of concrete sense of what that might look like as time goes on. Maddie, do you want to start again?
Sure. Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. So I think that one thing to think about too with stalking and examples of stalking is the context is critical with who the victim and the focus of the stalking is. So something that might not look very serious to you or I from an outsider's perspective may be very different for a victim of a crime. So a lot of times, the opposing parties on these cases or the stalker might use very significant things to stalk a victim to stalk the victim. So for me, a lot of the stalking that I see is post breakup and intimate partner violence. It does occur during that as well. Like I said, it's a lot of checking the phone. Where are you? Having making the victim have location services on in their phone, I think is a big one as well. So once the breakup happens, that abuser already knows and has established that pattern and knows where a victim might be through their day. So for me, examples of stalking that come to mind are people who are going to work and they realize, well, my ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend is in the parking lot and I wasn't expecting them to be here. They have no reason to be at the parking lot at my work. They don't work here. They don't know anybody here besides me. So that can be one form of stalking. Like Rebecca was saying, these things take place over time. Like they're pervasive, but also sometimes there's more than one thing at play. So there's surveillance, there's intimidation. If I can't have you, I'm gonna hurt myself or I'm gonna hurt your family members. So this stalking can sometimes come come as a form of a threat as well, showing up constant texts or phone calls, asking people information about you that that they really don't have any need to have. But again, that context, if your friend doesn't know that you broke up with this person and they have these stalking behaviors, your friend might give them information that they don't realize could put you in danger. So I think that is another thing that does happen a lot, is just unawareness by third parties, and it can create a safety concern for a victim.
Thank you so much, Maddie. One thing that you said that I think is really crucial is that what might not look threatening to an outsider, it may be, like very disturbing to the person that's experiencing the stalking. And I'm just wondering if you have some examples of the type of thing
Sure.
that might not be seen as threatening to an outsider.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I think one that really comes to mind quickly for me is a client of mine called once who was really upset because her abusive ex-boyfriend found her new place of work. Now her work people didn't know that it was a new place that he wouldn't know, but he showed up with flowers and left them there for her. So that immediately created this anxiety for this woman who, on the outside it looks nice. Oh, my boyfriend sent flowers, and he identified himself to her new coworkers as the boyfriend. But to her wheels are going. How did he find that I work here now? Was he following me? Is there a tracker on me? Did somebody tell him about me? But on the outside, it just looks like somebody offering flowers and, sending this nice message, when really the message was very anxiety provoking for her.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Rebecca?
To add on top of what Maddie said and not repeat any of that with the same situation, most common example that I see happens in child custody cases where we have two parents that are no longer in a relationship and we've split the household up and there's one or more kids and we have to deal with exchanging of kids for custody. And also, so a common thing that I have seen over the years is something like one parent lives here, the other parent lives far away, so they decide to move into the same neighborhood so that they're closer to the kids. So now they're within the same school district, same township, same area. And that's not technically anything that's illegal or preventable in most of these instances. So then things ramp up and it now becomes easier because that person's there. And you see things like driving past the house, driving past the school, driving past knowing, things like knowing that they were at the Target, stuff like that. A new one that I have seen since 2020 has been abusers becoming delivery drivers. So now they are working for and you'll have to forgive me, I don't know all the services out there that deliver things from food to goods, but they're working for even the local pizza man or the Grubhub or the Instacart or the whatever, sometimes even Uber and Lyft drivers, which gives them a reason to be there. It gives a pizza delivery driver has a reason to drive past your house because they could say they're on their way to a delivery. So that way they're checking, are the lights on? Are the cars in the driveway? Are there extra cars in the driveway? What are those license plates? Who do those cars belong to? And so it's an ever-changing thing. And it is absolutely 100%, like Maddie said, just because it looks like something non-threatening and maybe even a nice gesture to the outside eye, to the victim, it is enough to shake them at their core. And it becomes a really difficult task in understanding why. And I think that there are certain individuals and groups out there in our communities who are more receptive to understanding why. Our victim service providers, both Maddie and Jane here. And then people who are not all the time, unfortunately, is law enforcement. And they don't understand why the victim is so upset because they got flowers at work. And it leads to a negative interaction. And unfortunately, I think we see that be one of the main reasons that victims stop reporting things, is because of how they're treated when they do go to seek help with things.
I think that's something that we definitely need to elaborate on and expand upon as we're doing, as we're going through this webinar. I'll give Jane a chance to give some concrete examples from her work experience, and then we can elaborate on it.
Yeah, at PAR, we tend to see a lot of cyber stalking as the primary means, less showing up in person, mostly because I would say the vast majority of our clients have already had some kind of they reported to Title IX or they reported to law enforcement, and so the person who committed the harm who is now stalking is already on notice. And so they know if they show up somewhere that they're more likely to face consequences, where it's easier in this day and age. The laws haven't really caught up with cyber capabilities yet. So we see a lot of Snapchat interactions. People have, can find people on SnapMap, but it's also creating new accounts and trying to get them to accept. A lot of Instagram, and it can be really hard. Going along with the law enforcement not understanding, it can be really hard to explain to a police officer, you're like, I know that this is this person, but you can't tell it's this person based on their info, their screen name. And so it can be really difficult to track that kind of stuff. But we tend to see that a lot. Especially in PFA or SVPO cases. A more I would say interesting example we had very recently is a client who was actually in the process of doing address confidentiality. But before they had done that, she received a letter with typed up lyrics to a Taylor Swift song called Mastermind, which kind of hints at like a almost like threatening, like stalking nature. And it was just really interesting to see that like you couldn't prove that it was this person, but like who else would have sent like threatening Taylor Swift lyrics to this person? So we see examples like that too. And that's because the person had gotten word that our client had reported to the police and the police were trying to talk to them. And then all of a sudden, 4 days later, this showed up in the mail. So it tends to be a lot of, at least in our cases, indirect communication through social media or mail or something like that, unless in person. Usually, if it is in person, it's prior to any sort of police reporting or Title IX reporting, because once people are on notice, they know that like, oh, if I'm standing outside their house, like I'll get arrested, but they can't prove I was that Instagram handle that was sending those threatening messages. So that tends to be the most common stuff we see.
Thank you so much. Before we get further into the law enforcement dynamic of it, I just wanted to ask what the prevalence of stalking is, and what do we tend to who are the most affected groups? I will be um, having different panelists start, but Maddie, let's start with you on this one as well.
Okay. So I think I got my statistics from Spark, which is the Stalking Prevention Awareness Resource Center. So the statistics right now are approximately 1 in 3 women and approximately 1 in 6 men will be stalked over the course of their lifetime. The most affected group of people are the college-aged individuals, 18 to 24. I think that also touches on what Jane was just saying about cyber stalking. I think that, when you're in like that college age, you're so connected with so many forms of social media, but you're also on a campus at all times, most of the time, I should say. Oftentimes, and there are just easier tactics for those stalking activities to happen, especially if you're in classes and a stalker or an abuser knows your patterns. So I think that kind of answers that question, Erin. If I'll pass it along to Rebecca or Jane if they have any other updates on that.
I think the only thing that I could add is that of those who did report stalking by someone that they did know, over half, like, because I've seen numbers from 60 to 80%. So I'm just going to say over half, since I can't verify the research on them, say that the person stalking them is an intimate partner.
Thank you. Jane, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. The only thing I can think of is we see for the the majority of our stalking cases are usually from someone who is or was a partner, or someone like they went on a date with, however you loosely define that. But for people who are stalked by people they don't know, we tend to see that the most in high school students, actually. And probably like young college age. But to me, that makes sense because they might not have as much like social media literacy or like internet safety literacy as someone who's older, and also just teenagers in general spend more time on the internet, which I think can lead to like more of that like stranger stalking behaviors. I think like sexual assault, people tend to think, oh, it's someone following you down a dark alley, but usually it's going to be someone you know. And if it is a stranger, we tend to really only see that online.
Thank you. Let's start with Rebecca, and let's try to dig into this dynamic of, like what types of responses we tend to see from law enforcement, what responses we would like to see. And so let's just kind of look at what the what people can do in terms of going to law enforcement, and what some of those pros and cons are in terms of their response to this.
I'm going to preface everything that I say by saying, by no shape or form do I mean to throw the law enforcement in Allegheny County under the bus. However, just from doing the work that I do, I have observed that the majority of victims who report things to the police do not always have the best response. And when I say do not have the best response, I will simply classify that by saying an incident report isn't even written, because I think we'd all three of us would acknowledge that most likely these things that are being reported are not necessarily little crimes in their self. Back to the flower example, that is not a crime in itself, but was it documented by law enforcement? Did somebody actually sit down and talk to this victim? And if it wasn't a crime, did they say, we think that you need to talk to these people about this issue too? They may be able to help you better. Now, does law enforcement always do that? I don't know. Are they required to do that? I also don't know that answer. So that's why I don't want to unfairly judge them, because I feel like I can't see the whole side of it. The times that I have seen law enforcement move quickly has been as if a minor is involved. Whether the minor was a subject of being stalked, or there was an incident that occurred during the stalking and it involved a minor, that it is at least my observation that law enforcement seems to act quicker.
Thank you. Jane?
Yeah, I would say that the vast majority of our cases that involve response from law enforcement are because stalking is combined with other crimes. So usually if you have a case of stalking, if you look at say like a criminal docket that we're working with, it's going to be, there's going to be rape, sexual assault, felonies all listed, and at the end it's going to have, F3 stalking, depending on like the severity. I have yet to have a case that was just stalking go forward in a criminal. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. I just have yet to have that personal experience myself. I do think that it usually is because stalking doesn't happen in a vacuum, and usually there are other crimes associated with that. And so I do think like that's part of the reason, but I also think, kind of like what Rebecca was getting at is that like if you just come in and are like, oh, my ex-boyfriend left me flowers, they're gonna be like, well, that's not a crime, so we can't charge them with a crime. Whereas if you come in and say, my rapist left me flowers, they'd be like, oh, okay, well, that's a crime. And so we're gonna charge both. So I think that is like the primary like reason behind it. I think also we have a long ways to go in updating like what is stalking. There's like this idea in some major cities that you can't stalk someone because it's just a coincidence they're showing up at your local coffee shop and things like that. And I do think there are some of those mindsets within law enforcement here in Pittsburgh. The idea of like, oh, it's a coincidence that they showed up at your school or at your work, when we know it's not. So I think that also is a reason why, for the vast majority of cases that we have, the only time you're going to get like an actual criminal charge of stalking is if it's in conjunction with other crimes being charged.
Thank you, Maddie.
I would agree with what Jane and Rebecca have already said. I think one unique circumstance we see a little bit more working with intimate partner violence is with PFAs, which are protection from abuse orders. If there is a PFA violation, Women's Center Shelter has been working primarily with Pittsburgh Bureau of Police's domestic violence unit for any PFA violations that occur in this city. We try to advocate to have a stalking charge in addition to the PFA violation. It is tough, I will say that. It's not been an easy process because stalking, like we've already said several times, it is that context, and you have to show that the context is fearful for this person. So that can be challenging, and I think the three of us across the board have seen that challenge play out. Um, it I think that we have a long way to go, but I think there is a framework in Allegheny County in the city of Pittsburgh to advocate, if you have a client or a person that you know that is being stalked, to have them reach out to a victim service provider, because I think there are ways that we can help to safety plan first and foremost, but also um, lay the groundwork so that we can explain to a law enforcement officer who is taking these reports, because a lot of times too, stalking doesn't just occur in one place. That's, by definition, it's all over the place. So if you're living in the city and getting stalked in the city, but then you go to Ross Park Mall for the day and he or she follows you through the mall, you're not reporting it to the same law enforcement. So it's really important to keep a journal of all the times that you've seen this person pop up, because then you can go to the police and say it's not just happening here. I think that is a huge tool that anybody can use as a journal to kind of support their own case, and be their best advocate for themselves.
Um, Maddie, can you explain what a protection from abuse order is? And also, like, in the context of stalking, like, what is the threshold upon which a person might usually be granted a protection from abuse order?
Sure. So protection from abuse order, just so everyone's aware, there's no such thing as a restraining order in the state of Pennsylvania. So there are three types of protective orders, and I'm sure Jane can elaborate too on some of these, and Rebecca. So a PFA, or protection from abuse order, can be requested in family division. It's a civil order, so you as a victim of domestic violence have to go to the family division of the criminal court, or of the courthouse, and request for relief to be granted. So you have to have a reasonable fear of bodily harm or safety in order to qualify for a PFA, we call it for short. And it has to be somebody that you are related to by blood, marriage, or intimate partnership. So this could be a parent, sibling, cousin, intimate partner, ex-partner, parent of your child. So that can grant you relief, where it says that an offender or defendant cannot abuse, harass, stalk, or threaten you in any place where you may be found. It evicts and excludes them from your home, business, work, children's daycare, school, any place of employment you have. And it also bars contact. So no third-party contact, no contact through social media, no direct contact. Stalking is, again, one of those things that can on its own stand to request relief through a PFA, but you have to show that you are in reasonable fear of safety as a result of the stalking. So that's the big thing, is you have to explain to a judge why you need this PFA, why just saying leave me alone isn't enough.
So in the case where the person gets flowers, and um how is one able to prove that that is reasonable fear in relation to a PFA?
I would argue that it could be. It's all, again, you have to, every person who files for a PFA meets with an advocate ahead of time. So that advocate's role is to help kind of delve into the details of what brought a person to the PFA office. So if somebody said to me, he showed up at my work and I got flowers. The questions I'd be asking is, well, what makes that scary to you? And then we document that. So it's maybe a message that they send, like, I'll find you wherever you are. If there's history of abusive behaviors or controlling behaviors, that can be documented in the PFA as well. So what's really important is to share as much information as safely as you can, so that a judge can help yourself through this process.
On
Thank you.
this
Go ahead,
topic,
Jane.
Erin, I can go over what an SVPO or a PFI is, which are different, but under like the same umbrella. So sometimes they're called different things because the law like has a bunch of different acronyms. So you might see like PSVI, but it's a sexual violence protection order. And that is for if you don't qualify for a PFA usually. So if it's someone who would not be considered like a family member or a former or current intimate partner. The definition can be pretty broad for that under the court. They try to encompass, you went on a few dates with someone under a PFA umbrella, but sometimes, you meet on like a dating app and you go out on one date and something happens and then they start stalking you. They most likely would not qualify under a PFA because it's just not considered a partner in that situation. For an SVPO, it's all like pretty much the same qualifications as a PFA, except there has to be a continuing harm aspect. So one incident is not enough. There has to be a pattern of behavior, which for a lot of PFAs also applies. But you can go and get a PFA for like a single assault. That doesn't mean you'll be successful, but like under the qualifications you can, whereas in SVPO, there has to be it's a higher standard of continuing harm. So there is a little bit more that goes into it, but in cases where, it is someone who is stalking you, those examples of them sending you messages or showing up places would be under that continuing harm umbrella. So people can go and get SVPOs if they don't fall under the PFA category. And then PFIs are protection from intimidation. And those are very narrow. They are specifically if the victim is under the age of 18 and the person who is doing the intimidation or the harassment or the sexual violence is over the age of 18, and it's not a PFA situation. So it would most occurrences, it's an adult neighbor or a teacher or a coach or something like that, where they're not a family member, but they're an adult. It's not like children against children. That would be an SVPO. So those are the other two options that you can get if you don't qualify for a PFA.
And where do you get those?
You will go to the same place you would for a PFA. You're going to go to the third floor of 440 Ross Street downtown. And you would just at the window, when you get directed there, you're just going to explain your situation. They're usually pretty good at letting you know if you need a PFA, an SVPO, or a PFI. And then if you didn't come with your own advocate, they're good at connecting you with whoever is there at the time, or who can be like brought in at the time to help you with the process.
Thank you. So what are some other options for a person who is experiencing stalking? So we have like the criminal and a civil option. What else? Like, what would you say to somebody who has experienced stalking? What kind of advice would you give them? Rebecca, do you want to start with that?
That's a hard one. One of the things that I always like to look at is for my clients, what are their goals? What do they want? And do they feel that they can achieve that? So, for example, if they want to move because they feel like moving may be a solution to the problem, what's the likelihood of them doing that? Are there steps that we can kind of discuss for them to take in order to make that a reality? Because the services that I provide are not long term, they are not forever. It is a short term service, and we have to identify goals that we're going to work on. With the overarching idea of connecting them to people like Maddie and Jane in their organizations who can kind of be that support long term. And because my position wasn't designed to be that. It was more to be a bridge and a facilitator than a long term provider. So figuring that kind of stuff out, as well as, I think if I had to give somebody advice on this kind of thing, I would say document as much as you can. Keep your evidence. Whatever way makes sense to your brain. You can get a notebook. You can put it in your phone, put it on a tablet, whichever way helps you do it. You also want to make sure that it's backed up somewhere. And let's work on finding you someone in the community that you can share this information with. Tell someone. Doesn't have to be law enforcement. Tell someone that this is going on so that they are witness to what you're experiencing. And if you need to, speak with our domestic violence providers and the people at PAR, if appropriate, to find out like what is considered good evidence, what is considered stuff that you would want to try to keep. Always protect your phone, back it up. This is the number one thing that abusers come for, the record. They can break it, they'll break it. And then, unfortunately, most often it's gone. So I think that's the best that I could say.
Thank you. Jane?
I just wanted to chime in. A resource that I've used for stalking, I put everything in a Google Drive, so even if my phone was broken or something happened, that it's backed up there. So and you can upload photos and documents. So that's what I've done. And also, Kenneth from our Carlow Police Department has put in some resources in the chat if anybody wants to check that out.
Yeah, I think the Google Drive is a really good idea. There's a few apps that work. I know off the top of my head, Bright Sky is one of them. And it is, you have an account with them. And so if your phone's broken or you lose it, whatever, you can log in on another device and it's going to be your information. And they have journaling so that you can log things and resources there. You put in your location and they'll connect you to local resources. I think there's a few apps, but that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. So that's also an idea. I think that beyond, police resources and PFAs, SVPOs, if someone is a university student, working with your Title IX accommodations can be really helpful. In ensuring protection, they can, have you move dorms, they can put in no contact orders, things like that. And kind of piggybacking off of the idea of like working with your clients, if you have someone who has the means and the ability to move, once they have moved, they can do the address confidentiality program through OVA, which is like a state PA resource. It's a pretty easy form to fill out. We help our clients fill out the form. Essentially what it does is it makes your address unfindable. So if you call like Duquesne Energy and you pretend to be someone and you are like trying to get your information, the address that they're going to have listed as like the main address is going to be OVA's address and not your personal address. Obviously like the energy company like has your address, but it's just not the one that's like accessible to the public, where a lot of companies will claim like people can't just like get that information. But if this is someone who was like your intimate partner, they probably know a lot about you. They'd be able to like fake out any security questions, things like that. And so that's just like a layer of protection that gives you a PO box that would be where things get sent, which can give people peace of mind. And because like the idea of like, if I move, what if they just find me again? So I think that's always an option. But I think the primary thing, most people don't have the means to just up and move, is safety planning, making sure that they have, people they can call if they feel unsafe, places that they can go, people they can stay with, a pre-planned plan in place if they see this person or if this person starts talking to them. Always recommend like locking down social medias, making sure that you've blocked everyone, and things like that, I think are like the primary things you can do that are a little like easier steps than, just like packing up everything and moving house and quitting your job and trying to do like a modified witness protection. That's hard for people to do. And so a lot of times things that just make you feel safe, knowing that like if something does happen, I have somewhere to go. It might not prevent the stalking, but it will, help regulate that anxiety that a client might feel because of that.
Thank you, Maddie.
So I obviously agree with everything Rebecca and Jane said. I think another thing to think about too, when you're trying to make a decision on how you want to move forward, is through the technology aspect of it. So a lot of people will change their phone numbers, but they might use the same like cloud email address. I would recommend if you're going to change your phone number, also change your cloud. Like if have an iPhone, make a new email address, because if your opposing party knows anything about you, like Jane said, they know your email address and they probably have a good idea of what the password is. So making a completely new email and putting all of the important documents into that email. So all of your bills, anything that, personally for a Google Drive, things like that. Doing as much to separate yourself from that person that your abuser knew or your stalker knew is really important, I think. Changing your routine as much as possible. So if you are somebody who takes a bus to and from school, work, anywhere, maybe taking the bus at a later time or using a different bus stop is a recommendation I like to make. Just to kind of not using the same one every time. So make it a little harder for somebody to follow your pattern. I think that really can help a lot more than it looks like at like the surface level. I think I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. And then documenting. So Jane had mentioned the Bright Sky app. There's another one as well. It's called Tech Safety, and it's through NEDV. And it's just, I don't know if my phone will show you it, but it's like a little app that I have downloaded on my phone, and it has all different kinds of things. So phone safety, harassment, location safety. So also, we have so many apps on our phones, and there are all of those little fine print that you have to agree to. A lot of those can say that you have location services on. So making sure your location services are off is really important, and not just turned off for your stalker, but turning them off in general can really help. Not tagging yourself on social media can also help because you don't know who that stalker knows. So, you kind of have to reframe how you do things, maybe not posting while you're at a place and post later. If you went to a concert, for example, don't post while you're at the concert. Wait till you get home and put your pictures on then, so that you put some space and time between yourself and where you were. I think that's a helpful little thing to do too.
We have a question from Julie in the chat if anyone would like to answer that.
And Julie says, if the victim is a person with disabilities and is being stalked, how would you be able to help the victim?
I think that's a great question, Julie. I think just like any other person who's being stalked, everything is individualized. So, is there a specific part? Everybody has a unique set of circumstances, I think. So, um, can you elaborate a little bit more if you're able to?
I sure can. I really don't want to talk about my experience, but I can because I am a survivor of domestic and sexual violence, but they were like different years apart. However, my intimate partner violence was like a few years ago, and I did file a PFA against him. And when he got released from jail, he stalked me, and the PFA was still in order. So he stalked me by living up the street, and then they didn't like it, and they told him that he had to leave, and he moved upstairs from my place. So like the upstairs apartment of my house. Well, my neighbor did know about the PFA and him going to jail and everything. It all went downhill. Eventually, my landlord kicked out the neighbors upstairs. So 3 years later, he contacted me on Facebook at 2 different times. So it's an ongoing process, I guess.
I'm sorry that that's happening to you, Julie. I'll put my name in the email in the chat. Maybe we can talk off camera if
Thank
that's
you.
okay with you. Okay.
I think one thing kind of more in like a general, not addressing like that specific, is that people with disabilities tend to be stalked and experience sexual violence at higher rates than people without disabilities. And it is something that really does need to be talked about more and, brought into the conversation more because while yes, like everything is individualized, certain resources are just not going to be available to certain people depending on what the disability is. And so I do think it's important to work with various organizations in combination. I don't think just like one of us can do it alone. Because while we, at PAR might have the resources to help you throughout any sort of, therapy services or a criminal investigation, whatever that might be, we might need to put you in connection with an organization that can provide transportation. If the transportation you previously used is no longer available, and if you have a disability that makes it so you can't, maybe use the bus or you can't drive, so you need to have a safe form of transportation to get places. And so I think it's important, like the onus is more on like us as providers to be able to ensure that we're working with every aspect that our clients might need in order to make sure that they're getting connected with resources, and to make sure that somebody who might have more needs than somebody else can still have those needs met, even if it's not something that we provide. And so my hope is that if you have this experience or someone who needs more help, that it might not just be, working with one center, but that hopefully in combination, all the needs can be met, because in theory, it should all be the same for everyone, but just the reality is that that's just not what happens. And so hopefully, if we, but the onus should be on us, not the people with disabilities, to figure that out. And so I'm so sorry, Julie, that you've had to go through this experience. And hopefully you can speak with Maddie after and get help with that.
Thank you. And please feel free to put any other questions in the chat as we're going. There are a couple of things that we haven't touched upon yet. One is about revenge porn. What is revenge porn, and how, just elaborate on that. Who wants to start?
I can start. Or Jane, you know what, Jane, I'll let you go.
Sure.
Since this is more your arena, and then I can add what I can add to the conversation.
Yeah, well, by definition, revenge porn is the distribution of sexually explicit images or videos of an individual without their consent. And usually it's done as a form of retaliation, hence the word revenge porn. It is a crime. It is a crime in and of itself, and it has the crime added to of child pornography if the person in the pictures are under the age of 18. Even if the person who received them is also under the age of 18. So that's also important to keep in mind. Usually, they could be either pictures that were taken with the person in the picture's knowledge. So they could have been sent by the person, or they could have consented to the being filmed, but they didn't consent to the release and the dissemination of those pictures, or they could be taken without their knowledge. So that could be via like a hidden camera, something like that. So it can be either or. Just because you've consented to sending someone pictures or having a video taken of you does not mean you've consented to have other people watch or look at those pictures. So I think that's an important distinction when talking about revenge porn. It's I think a common thing we see in retaliation, especially post breakup situations, whether that's something casual or something more serious. A lot of times when we see revenge porn, we see this idea of like, well, we broke up and then they showed my pictures to everyone or they posted them on the internet or something like that. That's also another aspect, is they could be uploaded to the internet and be made public, or it could be just they were texted or Snapchatted to someone else who did not have permission to see them. So that's more of like the legal definition of what revenge porn is.
So mainly doing work in the protection from abuse department umbrella. The way that we most commonly see revenge porn is when a relationship splits and the one side releases those images or videos either to friends, family, coworkers, spouses, the person down the street. I've seen a very large list. The new boyfriend or girlfriend. Unfortunately, children, people's children. So there is no actual list of who would be on par to get information like that. And sometimes it happens once, sometimes it happens more than once. I've seen instances where things like that get put on social media, like we'll use Facebook, for example. And I think we all know that once it gets out there into the interwebs, it's kind of hard to get control over, which can be something that is very alarming and upsetting to victims. And over the last, I'm going to say 6 to 8 months, in the cases that I have seen a prevalence in the use of the word revenge porn or words. Was that prevalence there 6 months ago? Not really. Were victims saying it? Not really. Were they putting it on paper? Not really. Is that something then that, in our practice, we would find out after the petition was filed for protection from abuse? Yes, often in times during conversation with the victim for their case, we'd find out information like that. I've heard information like that. But for whatever reason, in the last 6 months, victims have found a voice. And that's where the whole conversation with Maddie and I started on this. Just to say, I can't sit here and say that there's an actual increase in the crime. What I feel more comfortable saying is that there's now a voice. And unfortunately, if there is no legal relief, whether it's in criminal court or civil court, for the victim, how do we create a space so that they can continue to safely put that voice out there and to continue to work through that so that they have a decreased chance of it negatively impacting them, and they can reach the goals that they have for themselves and for their families and for things. So it's something that we're seeing, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't older, younger, in high school, doesn't matter. It's coming out of all areas.
Thank you. We have a question. Carissa says, what if someone sent you an unsolicited picture and you posted on social media and tagged their mom and grandma in the picture? Would you get in trouble for distribution because they were using it to harass you?
In a perfect world, I would say no. But in the world we live in, I think that would be grounds for, at the very least, them filing a harassment charge against you. Ideally, we would have a system that acknowledges that if you're being the victim of harassment and you're trying to use everything like in your toolbox almost to fight it, and one way is to, post this as a way to get them to stop sending you pictures. In my head, that makes sense. Like, I see why someone would do that, and I see how it could prevent future harassment. Sadly, the criminal crimes code has not adapted with that type of thought, and so a lot of times in those cases, you would see 2 charges of harassment against going both ways, or you might see a PFA going one way and a PFA going that way, or possibly both getting distributing charges on there. I think that would a DA actually go and try to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law? Probably not. They're usually aware of these type of situations, but I would caution anyone against doing that, only because I understand why someone would feel like they have to do that. And being honest, I feel like the thought would probably cross my mind too in that situation. If you do commit a crime, such as posting someone's pictures without their permission, you could be charged with that crime. And so I would just caution anyone against doing that, especially because I don't think we've seen an uptake in this, but it's been pretty consistent. But getting sued for slander, libel, things like that is a very common retaliation that abusers use against their victims. And I could see in a situation like this where you might be sued civilly because they would be able to phrase that as defamation, if that makes sense. And so I do think that if you did that, it would open you up to a lot of criminal and civil charges. I don't think that it should, but in the system that we have, I think it would. And so I would caution anyone against doing that.
Thank you. We also wanted to go into a little bit more depth about different forms of the intersections of stalking and technology. And both, we've talked about some resources regarding technology that we can use, but what else have you seen in relation to the use of technology with stalking? And also, what are some resources that are there any further resources that we haven't discussed yet to deal with that? Jane, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So I think that, like I mentioned earlier, at PAR, we tend to see a lot of cyber stalking and using technology as a way to stalk someone and to control someone, manipulate someone, as well as, with the dissemination of intimate images, usually in this day and age is entirely online. I do remember once when I was a student at the University of Pittsburgh, and someone did throw nude pictures over the Cathedral of Learning side, printed out. So in theory, it still happens not online, but the vast majority of cases are going to be over the internet. And sadly, like Rebecca mentioned earlier, once something's on the internet, it's pretty much out there forever. And it's hard to protect yourself fully. We've looked into means of blocking someone when they keep changing their number, or they get a Google phone number, and it can be really hard because you can only block that number. If they're making new Instagram accounts, you can only block them as they come. It's hard to get the actual source person taken away. Same with Snapchat, like any social media, it can be really hard to block someone when you know that they keep changing their username or whatever it might be. So I think what we need in the future is ways to do that. But sadly, that hasn't really happened yet. So our recommendation, what we tell our clients is just keep blocking them, don't engage. Call us and we can, have some crisis counseling about it if we need to. We can talk about it. We can report it to if you want to report it. If you have an outstanding like PFA, we can get it reported to who needs to hear it for a PFA violation. Or if it's your university, whatever it may be. But that you're just going to have to keep blocking them as they come. As for if your pictures are out on the internet, there are some websites that have made headway in combing through websites to get pictures that are not allowed to be out there. So it does cost money. So far, there are no free websites that do this or free companies that do this. But we've had a few clients who had their pictures without their permission posted to pretty like big porn websites, and a company they paid was able to get most of them, if not all of them, for one of them taken down. Obviously, the dark web exists. It's probably still out there, but it's just not the first thing when you Google that pops up. And so that's something that people do have as an avenue. Sadly, it still costs money. And I'm not honestly sure if like victims compensation covers that. I would have to look into that. But if there are ways to get like that kind of stuff covered, PAR would try to work in order to find money to cover that, because everyone deserves the right to not have their pictures out on the internet. And so if there's any way we can get those things taken down, whether it's sometimes if you email those companies, they'll take them down because they also don't want to get sued in any sort of way. So we'll help with that process. But as far as the stalking on technology, the only advice we give is just keep blocking them, which is honestly hard to hear when you're like having to deal with this constantly, but it's really so far the only recourse that we've found.
Thank you, Jane. Maddie and Rebecca, do either of you have anything to add with that?
I mean, I could just say that technology and where we are now in 2023, it has made stalking easier. It has made stalking easier. There are trainings out there for people who are interested. Some of them are free, open to the public, on things like technology and stalking. If you want to know more from the people in the state of Pennsylvania who are, have the resources to track those kind of things and work those kind of cases on the criminal side of stuff. And I think almost one of the hardest things to do, but something that victims need to be cognizant of, is that you have to decrease your digital footprint. I know we all live in a world of Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all that. But not only can you not be putting things out there, like where you are, that you went to the concert, that you had this to eat, but you're also probably going to need to ask your friends and family to respect not putting pictures of you out there if you show up at your cousin's birthday or a family reunion over the summer. Because somehow stalkers and abusers tend to find these things. I always like to tell clients, if I can find you, I don't know anything about these platforms, somebody else is going to find you. You need to pull that presence back, because while it is a great service for us to be able to connect to different people's communities and ideas, it can also become harmful. And this individual has found a way to make it harmful. And if your phone starts acting crazy, so you have an iPhone or an Android, and that thing just stops working and it's blinking and things are going on and you don't understand, your battery's dying, it's a newer phone. I always tell people, take it to your carrier. Take it to your cell phone carrier, whoever that is. Ask them. If it's an Apple, take it to them. See if there's any way for them to look on your phone and see if there is anything hidden on there. As unfortunately, sometimes we don't keep track of them, and we let them sitting on a table, sitting on our desk at work, and we go to the bathroom and run down the hall. And it is shockingly scary how quickly people can gain access to phones. And just be mindful.
Thank you. Maddie?
Just very quickly, not to belabor the point, but I think another thing that recently, for this past week, I've seen actually, I had a client whose phone was being spoofed. So her abuser was calling her from people's names that are in her contact list. So she was receiving all of these missed calls from her mom. But when she would call her mother back, it wasn't she would say, did you just called me? And her mom said, oh no, it must have been a pocket dial. Um, but it ended up she ended up answering one of the calls, and it was the person she was there to file a PFA against. So there are so many different apps right now, and air tags are a big thing. A couple of my clients have found air tags in the back of their car after their abuser had access to the car. So, just being mindful of what those kinds of things look like, especially tracking devices and your cars. If you carry a bag with you all the time, it would be really easy for someone to just throw something in it. Those little things that we kind of take for granted, I think, are important to just be mindful of when you're trying to safety plan about this kind of stuff. And especially, like we've all said, the location services on the phone apps is huge. Just make sure they're off, especially the ones where you're posting to different forms of social media. Um, but I think those are the big three that I've noticed most recently, are the spoofing air tags and the what is it, the hacking into the phones. So
Thank you. I think, you've given us so many, resources over the course of this time that I think that it really does make sense for us to compile all of the different pieces of advice that you have, because these are all really good. The final question, it's a combined question that I wanted to ask, is, about, um, so two quick things. One is, what is the impact of stalking on victims? And then the second question is, how can we increase awareness about the seriousness of stalking? So Rebecca, would you start with that?
If I had to say, and just list one impact, because I think we would all agree that there's the laundry list there of those. The largest impact that I have seen on the clients that I have had the privilege to work with is an erosion of confidence and self-doubt. Negative thoughts start to creep in, and they start to think they're crazy. And it puts them in a really dangerous spot of negative thinking and isolation and withdrawing. And we know, based on the data that we have and have had pulled for so many years on victims, that support is a key way through any form of abuse. And that support person could be someone who is a complete stranger to you. They could be a hotline worker for PAR or Women's Center and Shelter or one of our other agencies, because the anxiety monster has grabbed onto you at 2:30 in the morning and everybody else is asleep. And they are a great resource for that. And I think we need to continue to keep supporting them. The organizations that we have who give us that and give our clients that at 2:30 in the morning when I cannot. And as far as raising awareness, I thought about this one for a good bit today. I think the number one thing we can do to raise awareness is talk. This right here, what we're doing. Have a conversation and provide education from people who know what these things are and what these things look like and how they are defined, to provide education to friends, to families, to anybody out there who will listen, so that the non-victim knows what's going on when their friend, family, coworker comes to them and starts saying these things. We need to, I think that we have definitely seen over the last 5 years an increase and the conversations being had around gender issues and around gender violence issues in particular, around all of this stuff. And for me, that's just the beginning. And we need to continue having it and to get really down into the weeds on some difficult topics like what Julie brought up earlier today about disabilities. We, the providers, need to be strong enough to have those difficult conversations, not only for victims with disabilities, but victims who are not the common stereotypical what we think of victim, so that we can always be better to match what they're showing us.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Maddie?
I think that a big thing is, resources and awareness too, like Rebecca said. I can throw a few different websites in the chat for everyone to reference later. One that, in preparing for this present panel today, that I had found was coercivecontrol.org. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of that, but it is a great resource. Where you're actually you can take a self-assessment or work with somebody to take an assessment on their behalf, and it generates a risk profile as well as some tailored safety planning based on how you answered some questions. So even at the very least, like, you could start there if you're not ready to call a hotline, if you're not ready to take like major steps on this. But I think that's a good place to start. I think to backtrack, something that comes to mind for me when talking about how this impacts a person, it's an extremely fatiguing process. We're saying this so many times, document, document, document. It's not easy. And nobody is trying to sugarcoat that when you talk to advocates or helpers in the professional world or your friends. It's easier said than done. And we know that. And it's one of those things that you may not get how you are expecting the outcome to be right off the bat, because stalking is, like we have been talking about, it's a process, it's pervasive. We have to show the pervasiveness when we're trying to report these things. Don't give up when that happens. Keep working with people, update your safety plan. It needs to be dynamic too. So what worked for you 3 years ago might not work for you this year. It's hard, and you don't want to feel like you're always looking over your shoulder because you were at one point the victim of stalking or domestic violence or a sexual assault. So it's finding that balance for yourself too, of where can I let my guard down a little bit and where am I needing to kind of increase my safety and awareness of my surroundings, and using your safety net and your social network to do those things, I think, is really important. I think another thing too, just as like an aside, is we just as a society have kind of changed what stalking is in normal conversations. So when we talk about looking at somebody's social media profiles and we're like, oh, I was Facebook stalking you the other day, or I was stalking you on Instagram, it looks like you had a great weekend. Like, it kind of downplays what stalking really is to victims of stalking. So I would challenge everyone to try to change the language around your use in social media, so that people who are being stalked and are trying to report that to the right law enforcement agencies, that it isn't looked at as like just a basic thing that everyone's been doing on the weekends when you're scrolling through social media. I think that's really important to just kind of be aware of how we use language, especially around crime, crime language and statutes versus just everyday activities. And just to remember, stalking is very different than harassment. That harassment's annoyance and like just getting kind of frustrated or perturbed by something going on. Stalking has a fear element, and remembering that too when you're trying to decide, how do you move forward with this? Are you fearful of what's going on around you, and is it time to report that? So I think that can be a helpful thing too, is just to remind everybody of that.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, I think I agree with what everyone said so far. Also looking at the chat, what was just mentioned about having like open record laws, I think is a really good point. I think it kind of goes along with what Rebecca was kind of talking about earlier with like the idea of like the perfect victim. In people's head, a victim has never committed any sort of offense or crime. Like, why would they care about that? But the reality is, I mean, especially for summary offenses, I mean, that could be like a certain level of speeding. And you have to go into the magistrate's office. And I pull dockets every day with no clearance or having to log in. And so the fact that anyone could pull that docket and find all your information is actually truly alarming. And so I do think that, you know, our legislature does need to kind of update and do more to protect people's addresses and put things in place. I think even just how people in these systems don't even realize the actual impact they have. I think I had a client who filed a PFA and they filled out all the paperwork, the form for confidentiality, where they white out your address if you've already written down, or they just never enter it in the first place. And their new address that they had moved since the event was on the papers that were served to the person getting the PFA right there. And they started showing up at their house. And they thought the thought didn't cross their mind because they filled out all the confidentiality work. And so, you know, people in these systems need to realize that like what they're doing has real life impact. This isn't, you know, just, oh, someone's address is on there. Even I've seen people where they just like put Sharpie over things, and if you hold it up to the light, you can like still see an address. Like that can't be going out to the abuser's home. And so I think things like that are things that professionals need to take more step in order to protect victims of stalking. As for, I think that Maddie and Rebecca covered really like the impact of stalking. I think that there are many like long-term effects that haven't even really been studied yet, of like even a moment in isolation of stalking that would have on someone. It's directly related, you know, to trauma and like thinking about the lasting effects of trauma. But I think a big one that a lot of my clients talk about, which I think kind of goes off of what Rebecca was talking about earlier. I always think of it as like almost in person, like, or like by action gaslighting. So they're not actually like talking to someone and trying to make them think that you're crazy, but their actions make you think that you're crazy. And so I think gaslighting is like a big buzzword right now, but the idea that like someone can manipulate you through words into thinking that like you've made this all up in your head, but I think their actions can also do that. And so I'll have clients look me dead in the eye and tell me all the examples of them being stalked and then be like, well, that's not stalking, I'm not being stalked. That's a coincidence, or oh, it would just like happen this way. And I'm like, okay, like let's work with this, like let's talk about like what stalking is. And I think they genuinely have convinced themselves they're not being stalked because society has convinced them that they're not being stalked, that's not stalking, or the person that's stalking them has convinced them that's not stalking. And so I think validating and reassuring them and normalizing, you know, that like it's okay, you were stalked, like, you know, let's talk about it, let's validate those feelings is really important if you're working with anyone, because they're going to be working overtime to convince themselves sometimes that they haven't been stalked. And you don't want to plant the fear in anyone's head that they're being stalked. I'm not saying to do that, but you know, I think that and that goes along with the idea of, you know, what your words matter. So if you say like, oh, I stalked you over the weekend, then the next time they're being stalked, like Maddie mentioned, they might not actually think of it as actual stalking. That's what someone does to show that they care about you. And so I think that is something that definitely needs to, you know, be moderated in the future. Another one I think of is this idea of the like this is like very specific, but romantic comedies have convinced us in society that if you say no, that doesn't mean actually no, that I'm going to keep wearing you down until you say yes to a date. And I think that applies to stalking too. This idea that like you don't want to be with me, well, it's kind of cute and funny and quirky if I keep trying to convince you otherwise. And we're going to have a good laugh about it, and then we're all going to have a happy ending at the end. And I think that's normalized the behavior for the people who are committing the stalking, that they might not even think that they're doing anything wrong. Like they genuinely might think like, oh, this is how you win this person over. This is how I convince someone of my love for them. And the inverse is someone on the receiving end might be like, oh, well, they're just trying to show that they love me. And so I think society as a whole needs to, try to look at deeply like what we view as normal behaviors in a romantic relationship and what it actually is an unconsensual behavior.
Yeah, and along with that, how is society viewing that, like if a person thinks that it's normal, if the victim thinks that it's normal, but if the victim doesn't think it's normal, but society thinks it's normal, then the victim is going to continue to think that they're going crazy or feel invalidated. I would like to thank all three of you so much for this amazing insight and for all of these amazing resources that you've given us. I think that we have a lot to think about, and if and thank you for putting your contact information in the chat. Hopefully, if anybody needs to reach out, they will be able to reach out to you. And I would like to thank everyone for attending this presentation. And we appreciate your attendance, and please feel free to reach out to me at Project Safe or to reach out to any of the panelists. And I also want to remind everybody that we have our Pittsburgh University's Believe Survivors March is going to be on April 16th at 11 a.m. And so we look forward to seeing all of you there. And we're really excited about that. Thank you so much and have a great evening. Bye.
Have a good one.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.